My name is Claire Whitman, and I'm 32 years old. I've sat through a lifetime of family dinners, but there's one I'll never forget. The Thanksgiving when my brother decided to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved. That was the night something inside me snapped, and I promised myself I'd never let him get away with it again. Thanksgiving at the Whitman house was always a spectacle. A long oak table stretched down the dining room, groaning under the weight of roasted turkey, glazed ham, casseroles, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie cooling on the sideboard. My mother took pride in it every year. Her one stage to prove to the extended family that we were picture perfect. I slid into my seat near the middle, trying to smile, trying to let the warmth of the food and chatter soothe me. My cousins laughed at one end, my aunts and uncles clinked glasses at the other. And across from me sat my older brother, Greg, smug, polished, leaning back in his chair like he owned the table. Greg had always been the center of attention, and he thrived on it. His booming voice carried easily. His jokes punctuated with slaps on the table. People gravitated toward him like moths to a flame, even when that flame singed anyone in its way. And tonight, his eyes kept sliding toward me with that familiar glint, the one that always meant trouble. Started casually enough. Greg speared a slice of turkey, leaned back and smirked. "So, Claire," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the chatter. "How's life these days? Still working that, what do you call it, temporary job?" I stiffened, my fork pausing halfway to my mouth. He knew perfectly well what I did. I told him weeks ago I was consulting for a startup while lining up my next position. But he twisted it into something smaller, something laughable. The table quieted slightly, waiting for my answer. "It's contract work," I said evenly. "Short-term but valuable. It's actually going really well." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Contract work. But so basically unemployed with extra steps." Laughter rippled around the table. Not everyone joined in, but enough did, nervous, awkward chuckles that made the air feel heavy. My face burned. Greg wasn't done. He never was. "You know," he continued, reaching for the mashed potatoes, "this reminds me of the time Claire tried to cook a turkey for Friendsgiving in college. Remember that, Mom?" My mother gave a hesitant smile. "Greg." But he barreled on. "She put the thing in upside down. Can you believe that?" Smoke filled the apartment. The fire alarm went off. Half the guests left before the food was even edible. My cousins laughed openly now. One of them muttered, "Classic Claire." I forced a tight smile, gripping my fork so hard my knuckles ached. It had been over a decade ago, a silly mistake I'd laughed about myself at the time. But Greg dragged it out like it was proof I was incompetent, the perfect story to brand me the family joke. I thought maybe he'd stop there. But Greg thrived on momentum. "And speaking of smoke," he added with a sly grin, "Claire, didn't your last relationship go up in flames too? What was his name again?" The laughter this time was sharper, meaner. My chest constricted. "That's enough," I muttered, my voice low. But Greg leaned forward, relishing the attention. "Come on, don't be so sensitive. We're family. We can laugh, can't we?" The table buzzed with unease, but no one stepped in. Not my parents. Not my aunts and uncles. No one. I excused myself to the kitchen, the walls of the dining room pressing in on me. My eyes stung, but I refused to let the tears fall. I gripped the counter, listening to the muffled laughter behind me, the sound of my brother basking in his triumph. That was the moment something hardened in me. I had swallowed his jabs for years, told myself it was just Greg being Greg. But tonight, in front of everyone, he had crossed a line I could never uncross. Later that night, when most of the guests had left and I went back to grab my coat, I heard him. Greg stood near the doorway with one of our cousins, his voice low but smug. "She'll never amount to anything," he said with a laugh. I just make sure the family remembers that. Keeps her in her place. The words slammed into me, sharper than any joke he'd made at dinner. This wasn't just teasing. This was deliberate. This was cruel. And as I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, I made myself a promise. Greg thought he'd humiliated me tonight. But he had no idea. The next time he tried to put me down, I'd be ready. And when I turned the table, it would be in front of everyone. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. I didn't need to hear Greg's smug words that night to know he believed them. The truth was, Greg had been putting me in my place for as long as I could remember. People like to say sibling rivalry is normal, that brothers tease, sisters bicker, and it's all part of growing up. But with Greg it was different. It wasn't playful. It wasn't harmless. From the time we were kids, he lived to make me small. When I was 7, I built a little Lego house I was so proud of. I showed it to my parents at the kitchen table. Before they could even look, Greg swooped in, smirked, and snapped it apart. "That's not a house. That's garbage," he said. My parents sighed but didn't scold him. They just told me, "You can build another one." When I was 10, I got a part in the school play. I was nervous but thrilled, rehearsing my lines at dinner. Greg leaned back in his chair, mimicking me in a high-pitched voice, making my cousins howl with laughter. "She thinks she's an actress," he sneered. "Don't forget your real talent, burning toast." Again my parents chuckled and shook their heads. Greg stopped teasing. But there was no real consequence. Little by little, I learned the lesson. Greg could do no wrong. No, I was fair game. Greg was the golden boy. He scored the winning touchdown in high school football, and the family threw a party. He got an average grade but sweet-talked a teacher, and my parents bragged about his charm. Me. I brought home straight A's, and the response was, "That's what we expect from you, Claire." It wasn't that I wanted to take his spotlight. I just wanted to share it. But in my family's eyes, Greg shined brighter simply because he was louder, flashier, harder to ignore. No. I disappeared in his shadow. By the time we were teenagers, Greg's jabs were sharper, disguised as jokes that everyone else seemed to find hilarious. At a family reunion, an uncle asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I said shyly, "A writer." Greg laughed so hard he nearly spit out his soda. "A writer? What's she gonna write about? How to fail at life?" Everyone chuckled. I forced a smile, my cheeks burning. When I brought my first boyfriend home at 18, Greg grilled him mercilessly, pointing out every flaw. "He drives a beat-up car. Wow, Claire, you really know how to pick winners." The poor guy never called me again. Greg grinned like he'd done me a favor. It wasn't just that he embarrassed me. It was that he did it publicly every chance he got. And every time, the family either laughed along or stayed silent. Meanwhile, I became the responsible one. The helper. The one who picked up slack when Greg bailed. When our grandmother fell ill, it was me sitting by her bedside, reading to her for hours. Greg popped in once, took a photo with her, and posted it online with a caption about, "Family first." My parents praised him for it. When our parents needed errands run or chores done, they called me. "Greg's busy," they'd say. Busy with what? I never knew. But the unspoken rule was clear. I handled responsibility, he handled glory. And the more I quietly carried, the more invisible I became. Looking back, the Thanksgiving table had always been Greg's stage. When I was 21, I came home from college excited to share that one of my short stories had been published in the university journal. Before I could finish, Greg interrupted. "Don't worry, family, it's not like anyone outside her dorm will read it." Laughter erupted, and my accomplishment drowned under his punchline. When I was 26, I just moved into my first apartment. My mom asked how I liked it, and I said proudly, "It's small, but it's mine." Greg leaned in with a smirk. Translation: it's a shoebox with plumbing problems. My uncle roared with laughter. And again the moment was stolen. Year after year, he found ways to turn me into the joke. And year after year I smiled weakly, told myself it didn't matter, tried to believe I was strong enough to brush it off. But it did matter. And deep down, every jab left a mark. By the time I hit 30, I'd carved out a life for myself outside their approval. I had my own circle of friends, my own apartment, a career that wasn't flashy but paid the bills. I'd found pieces of peace. But family has a way of pulling you back into old roles like quicksand. No matter how far I went, Thanksgiving was the same. Greg the star, me the punchline. And this past year he escalated. After that humiliating dinner, I thought I'd walk away and lick my wounds in silence. But then I started hearing things from relatives. A cousin texted me, "Hey, Greg said you're bouncing between jobs again. You okay?" An aunt asked at the grocery store, "Sweetheart, Greg told us you've been struggling? Living paycheck to paycheck. You know you can ask for help, right?" Each word was a knife. Greg wasn't just mocking me at the table anymore. He was building a narrative behind my back. A story where I was the screw-up, the embarrassment of the family. And people believed him. That's when I realized. Greg's cruelty wasn't random. It was deliberate. He needed me to be small so he could keep being big. And if I let it go on, he'd never stop. The next Thanksgiving was coming fast. And I knew one thing for certain. This time I wouldn't sit quietly while he laughed. I was going to be ready. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. The night I left my parents' house after Thanksgiving, I drove aimlessly through the cold November streets, the steering wheel slick under my hands. I replayed Greg's words in my head like a recording I couldn't turn off. She'll never shine. She knows her place. For years I'd told myself he was just a bully, just an older brother who never grew up. But this was different. This was deliberate. He wanted to define me, to trap me in a role he created. The family embarrassment. And I realized something that night. The only reason Greg had power was because I kept giving it to him. That was going to change. The hardest part of planning revenge wasn't what people think. It wasn't coming up with the right strategy or choosing the right moment. It was admitting the truth. I had let Greg humiliate me year after year because deep down, I was afraid of becoming the person he said I was. Failure. Joke. Someone who would never shine. But standing there in my tiny apartment, coat still wrapped around me, I whispered to myself, "That's not me. That's his story. Not mine." The tears that spilled down my cheeks weren't just from hurt. They were from clarity. Greg liked to pretend he was untouchable. The golden child. The success story. But I knew the truth. And I knew where to look for the cracks. Over the next few months I started paying attention. I noticed how often he bragged about his job, but never gave specifics. "Business is booming," he'd say. Yet his car payments were late. And my cousin mentioned overhearing him arguing with his boss on the phone. I remembered the girlfriend he'd brought to Easter, a woman who disappeared by summer. When I bumped into her later by chance at a bookstore, she raised her eyebrows when I mentioned Greg's name. "Let's just say he's not as charming as he thinks," she said before walking away. And then there were the little lies he told casually, the kind he thought no one noticed, about grades he never earned, promotions he never got, money he never had. I started keeping notes. Not gossip. Not rumors. But verifiable things he had said and done. Small pieces of evidence tucked into my phone and my memory. It wasn't about destroying him. It was about balance. If Greg wanted to shine a spotlight on me, I'd be ready to shine one back on him. Revenge isn't just about what you say. It's about how you say it. Greg thrived on my reactions. He wanted me flustered, red-faced, stammering. That made his jokes land harder. That made his audience laugh louder. So I practiced control. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and practiced answering his jabs with calm, measured words. I imagined him sneering, "Claire's just doing temp work again," and I'd reply smoothly, "At least my work doesn't fire me every other month." I pictured him boasting about his dating life, and I'd smile thinly, saying, "Funny, I thought you were still texting your ex at midnight." It wasn't about cruelty. It was about precision. Turning the table in seconds. Making him the punchline instead of me. By the time the next Thanksgiving rolled around, I was ready. More ready than I had ever been. The week before, I felt the nerves in my stomach, but they weren't the same as last year. This time they weren't fear. They were anticipation. I walked into my parents' house carrying a pumpkin pie I'd baked myself, my head high, my heartbeat steady. The dining room looked the same as always. The polished table, the clinking glasses, the relatives buzzing with chatter. And there he was, Greg. He grinned when he saw me, that same smug glint in his eyes. "Claire. Perfect timing. We were just talking about you." I smiled back, but this time there was steel behind it. Because what Greg didn't know was that tonight, I wasn't the same sister he'd humiliated before. Tonight I was ready. The house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon again, the same way it had every Thanksgiving since I was a child. But this year, as I walked into the dining room, the weight pressing on my chest wasn't dread. It was anticipation. Greg sat at his usual spot, already grinning like a comedian warming up for his act. The relatives clustered around him, leaning in the way people do around someone who's loud enough to fill the room. My parents bustled in and out, smiling tightly, pretending they didn't notice how much he dominated the table. I set my pumpkin pie on the sideboard, smoothed my dress, and slid into my seat. I didn't need to say a word. I just waited. 'Cause I knew him. And I knew he couldn't resist. It came before the turkey had even been carved. "So, Claire," Greg said, his voice booming across the table, "how's that temporary job of yours going? Or is it another new one this time?" Few chuckles bubbled up. I caught my aunt shifting uncomfortably, but no one said anything. I smiled, keeping my voice even. "Actually, it's going well. Better than yours, I hear." The chuckles cut short. Greg blinked, caught off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. I tilted my head. "I just meant word gets around. Not everyone keeps their jobs as long as they say they do." A ripple of whispers moved down the table. Greg's face tightened. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. For the first time in years, he didn't have a comeback ready. But Greg wasn't done. He never was. Halfway through dinner, after a few glasses of wine, he leaned back in his chair, grinning again. "You know," he announced loudly, "Claire once tried to host Thanksgiving herself. Didn't thaw the turkey. Whole bird was frozen solid. We ended up eating takeout. Classic Claire, always a disaster." The laughter came quickly this time, full and bright. My face heated, but I didn't flinch. I'd rehearsed for this. I set down my fork, folded my hands on the table, and smiled. "Funny you mention disasters, Greg," I said calmly. "Because I ran into your old boss last month. He said you're still calling it a resignation, but he was pretty clear they fired you. For missing deadlines. Repeatedly." The room froze. Forks stopped midway to mouths. My uncle coughed. Someone muttered, "Wait, what?" Greg's face went red. "That's not." "Oh, and Jessica," I added smoothly, turning to my cousin. "Did you know Greg's been texting his ex at midnight while he brags about his dating life? He might tell you he's Mr. Perfect, but the receipts say otherwise." Few stifled laughs. Greg sputtered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, almost sweet. For once, the family wasn't laughing at me. They were staring at him. My father cleared his throat. "Greg, is that true?" Greg stammered. She's twisting things. But the damage was done. The spotlight he'd always used to humiliate me was squarely on him now, and he was shrinking under it. I leaned back, my smile calm. You wanted to tell stories, Greg. I just thought the family deserved the full picture. Greg pushed back his chair abruptly, muttering something about needing air. He left the table red-faced, his shoulders stiff. The silence stretched. Then slowly my aunt chuckled. Well, guess the jokes aren't as funny when they go both ways. A ripple of laughter followed. Not cruel but knowing. And for the first time in years, it wasn't me they were laughing at. It was him. The rest of dinner passed in uneasy quiet. My parents tried to smooth it over, urging people to eat, passing dishes with forced smiles. But the damage was irreversible. The story had shifted. Later, as I slipped on my coat, my mother touched my arm. Her voice was low, almost pleading. Claire, you didn't have to do that. I met her eyes. I didn't have to. But I did. Because he's not going to define me anymore. She had no reply. Driving home, the night air crisp against my cheeks, I felt lighter than I had in years. Greg had spent a lifetime trying to keep me small, making me the punchline so he could be the star. But tonight, I'd shown him what it felt like to be on the other side of the joke. And I hadn't screamed. I hadn't raged. I'd simply told the truth. He tried to embarrass me in front of the entire family. But I turned the table on him in seconds. And now, when my family remembers that Thanksgiving, it won't be my mistakes they laugh about. It will be the night Greg Whitman finally got what he deserved. Greg thought he'd keep me small forever, the butt of his jokes, the family's favorite target. But one Thanksgiving was all it took to end that story. I showed them the truth, and I showed him that I wasn't someone to laugh at anymore. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or mocked by the people who should have had your back, subscribe now. Because these stories of betrayal, justice, and revenge aren't just mine. They're ours.